Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Jaramillo GW Wash Processed Panama from Kabuki Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Kabuki, based out of Paris, France. And this is their third ever appearance on this channel, having recently reviewed the Amelia, a different wash processed Panamanian geisha. And when picking out coffees from Kabuki, this is the one that I was most excited about. And while I usually don't like picking up higher end offerings from coffee roasters I don't have any familiarity with, I decided to roll the dice on this one given just how much I love Hacienda La Esmeralda Panamanian geishas. So I figured there was no way I wouldn't enjoy this coffee. So we will see how it turned out. This right here is day 52. And recipe we went with for this coffee was the same recipe that we went with for the other Kabuki coffees at a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 93 degrees Celsius, about 199 degrees Fahrenheit through the V60. That being said, I actually think I enjoyed this one of the Kabuki coffees, pushing it a little bit more. At our higher end recipe for a 99 degrees Celsius, 210 degrees Fahrenheit at a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, and a slightly more fine grind on that V60 grind. A roast profile for this coffee is much more in line with the experience that we had with the Lorita, which we also described as being on the lighter end of things. Once again, we do highlight the fact that they are influenced by some ultra light based coffee roasters, and this coffee definitely did demonstrate that, as I wouldn't still say that it's on par with those coffees, but it definitely does skew in that direction, all of which to say that this is still a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 23, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was expectedly super clean and floral forward with an abundance of the classic Panamanian geisha characteristics presented in a white floral sense. Everything that I was expecting for this coffee with a complementary citric aspect, all of which presented on the sweeter side of things in an excellent layered cup. So I definitely have to say that it did lead itself to an excellent first impression. Day 26, through the Chemex, and the coffee was a little bit less intense than some of the previous offerings, or I should say experiences that we did have relative to the other Kabuki coffees, as it was a bit more generic floral and citric forward this time around. And given that of the coffees that we are or did review from Kabuki, this is the one that I had the best first impression of. Having this coffee backtrack on that second experience in the way that it did wasn't necessarily ideal, as I would describe this second day as being a bit more generic geisha-like this time around, as it didn't have the same level of layering, definition, or sweetness, a bit more just generic of a straightforward geisha-like experience. So I think that was a bit more of a byproduct of the brew method that we opted to go for, but it is kind of interesting that all of the Kabuki coffees that we've discussed up to this point have had a, we'll say, more sensitive nature to them, as the adjustments we've made oftentimes do impact the coffees a lot more than they do with a lot of other coffee roasters we review. Day 29, to the April brewer, and it's a better day as there's a bit of the creamy vanilla custard-like components to it, which is something oftentimes I experience with my favorite Esmeralda Panamanian geishas. So that certainly helped, and I already felt like this coffee was definitely back on track and improving, as it had a slightly higher than average level of intensity to it. Otherwise, more of the softer citric and stone fruit qualities yet again, so definitely going back in line with what I'm hoping for. Day 32 through the V60 with the higher extraction adjustments, and we've gone over this in the other Kabuki reviews where I mentioned that I felt like I probably should have gone the other direction with these coffees. This one is the exception though, as this was by far the best it had been, as it was presenting a lot more of the listed stone fruit qualities this time around. Even then, it's a bit softer. I mean, it is a Panamanian geisha than just the average coffee, but that's exactly what I was fully expecting and hoping for within this coffee. So a lot of positive experiences with that adjustment on this one. Day 35, through the Chemex with the lower extraction adjustments, and as mentioned, I found success with all of the other Kabuki coffees lowering the extraction, just going a little bit less intense with those, and as a result it wasn't quite as good as the previous day, as it continued to just yield potential on the cooldown, but for the most part it felt a little bit more generic. primary focus did feel a bit more on the jasmine floral side of things, with that vanilla sweetness presented yet again, and a relatively well-defined bergamot, so it wasn't quite as generic. Truth be told, I feel like that day 26 was a combination of not necessarily the ideal brew method, recipe, or rest time for that coffee, and on day 35, I think the amount of time that we gave it did help this coffee open up a little bit more, but even then, I don't necessarily think that the adjustments we made were ideal for it, as on day 38, we ran it through the V60 with the same adjustments, and there were some slightly mixed results, which does lead me to believing that we really should have pushed this coffee a little bit more than we did by the end. That's the negative side about these 100-gram bags of coffee, is when we're reviewing our standard bag of coffee, I can go through it 8 times. We have 8 brews, that's pretty standard for those, but on these ones, it is 7, and by that 7th day, I have to have it right, but usually that 7th day for our standard offerings gives me an opportunity to kind of finalize the idea of what should be best for this coffee, so I can go both directions. I can push it, I can go a little lower on the extraction, but as a result of this one, I had to take a guess. And I said, I think that maybe the V60 with the lower extraction adjustments might work, but that's why I think that it was probably better if you push this one a little bit more. So it does have a nice flavor separation to it. More of the vanilla-like custard sweetness to go with the prominent jasmine florality, and the florals, as fully expected, the most dominant aspect within this one. Slightly sweeter citrus to form a tangerine, and a bit more of the bergamot-like qualities to it. Stone fruits feel a little bit more toned down relative to some of the previous days, and that was the biggest sticking point to me on this one by lowering the extraction of it overall. So the coffee did offer an abundance of depth, but I think that I just liked the way that the flavor separation and profile was presenting itself a little bit more when we pushed this coffee a little more. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have a couple of level 5s. Let's go through those real quick, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 5. So as fully expected, once again, this is a Panamanian geisha, and I said in our previous Kabuki Panamanian geisha review, you can't always bank on and expect a Panamanian geisha to score a level 4. In fact, I believe we've reviewed Panamanian geishas in the past, washed ones that have scored as low as a level 3. Usually they're marred by something, but this one was marred by nothing. And given that it did have better definition and layering to it and flavor separation than the Amelia, the Larita Estate geisha, then it's not surprising that this one also did score a level 5, a little bit cleaner in that regard. Florality level 5, and I mentioned that that's one of the first experiences we did have with this coffee, and it was present throughout. Combination of that vanilla-like custard, which is definitely a characteristic from Esmeralda coffees that I've reviewed not just recently, but thinking very long into the past as well. And then more of those white floral qualities to it, which is certainly a characteristic of Esmeralda Panamanian geishas in general. So an abundance of those presented in a very clean sense. Really appreciated that about this coffee. We move on to level 4's finish. Level 4, certainly happy that we went back to the level 4 when it came to the finish on this coffee. And I liked the finish because it definitely did have a little bit of that lingering floral sense to it, in addition to that citric sense to it. So I know that that's a lot of what you would expect from a coffee like this, but given that the previous one had that in a kind of more fleeting finish, getting back to level 4 is definitely nice with this one. Sweetness level 4, I continue to highlight that custard-like feel to it, which is something that I really appreciate from Esmeralda coffees. It does give them a little bit of a unique feel. They're the ones that more often than not, I do get that citric grain quality that reminds me of Fruity Pebbles or at times Fruit Loops, but in this case, I didn't necessarily see any shades of that, as this coffee wasn't particularly grainy whatsoever, which it's kind of interesting. I think I kind of missed that from a lot of the Esmeralda coffees. I do like when that's presented because it does give it that kind of unique charm and characteristic. So level 4, where we put it because of that quality specifically. We move on to citrus level 4, and bergamot, I believe, is the note that they have listed on here. You can fully see that. I mentioned tangerine as one of the other citric qualities to it. Definitely a fair bit of citric depth, and you're definitely seeing them, or you're definitely feeling them felt in a very defined sense. A couple of level 3s. We'll start with the brightness level 3. It is kind of funny to me that the Aricha is the only one that scored the level 4, and I do feel like it was a byproduct of a little bit of a brewing error. But these Kabuki coffees weren't necessarily overly bright, and this one was certainly no exception to that. Stone fruit level 3, I think that they have a very generic stone fruit note listed on here, and at times it was presented a little bit more intense than others, most notably when we did push this coffee. So going back to it, I think that maybe that earlier mark where we went higher on the extraction of this one, I probably could have scored that at that level 4 mark, though it was never quite on par with the citric qualities in this coffee, and certainly not with the floral qualities. And then I think we just have one more thing worth discussing, which is the body level 2. It did have a little bit more texture to it, and I did keep that in mind given that we were working with this coffee and brewing this coffee alongside that Amelia de la Rita Estate Gesha. So I certainly felt a little bit more of a texture to it. I mentioned that vanilla custard, so just a slight bit more creaminess in that sense, leading it to scoring that level 2 a little higher in that sense. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Not surprisingly, of the 3 coffees that we had from Kabuki, this one was by far my favorite. But what got really tricky about this coffee was that I did enjoy it and I had a lot of positive things to say about it. But then shortly after working through this coffee, I did pick up a different Esmeralda coffee that we are in the process of working on. And I've found myself enjoying that Esmeralda significantly more than this one. So while in theory going into this, I felt like I was going to say a lot of positive things about it, and I still feel very positive about this coffee, I definitely think that we have another Panamanian Gesha review coming up here in the near future that I just happen to like a fair bit more than this one, both of which being Esmeralda Panamanian Geshas. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like this one is pretty classic for what you can expect from Esmeralda coffees, most notably in the uniqueness that it offers from that slightly vanilla-like feel to it. But outside of that, it definitely offers immense clarity and a very white floral forward experience, a lot of what you would expect from a coffee like this. In addition to that, a higher than average level of sweetness, which certainly helped, and a pretty well-defined citric quality. So if those are all things that you're looking for in a lighter profile, then I feel like this one's a very nice fit. But for the most part, that's the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Jaramillo GW wash processed Panama from Kabuki Coffee. Thank you for watching.